Following the success of Ratchet Deadlocked, Insomniac Games pushed forward in expanding their operations, working to simultaneously develop a brand new IP whilst also working on the next mainline entry in the Ratchet and Clank franchise. Their hope was to be seen as a far bigger player among Sony's vast catalogue of developers. However, with the PSP only a few years into its shelf life and still possessing a vast amount of untapped potential, Sony sought to push the hardware further by adding some of their biggest franchises onto their handheld console. No easy feat by any means unless you have first-hand experience with the franchise in question. You could potentially lose a lot of what made their games so much fun to begin with. So ideally, Sony would want Insomniac or people who have worked with them in the past to contribute to this endeavor. Fortunately for them, a new development studio consisting mostly of former Insomniac employees had officially been formed. They would be known as High Impact Games, and their first task would be to bring popular IPs like Ratchet and Clank onto the PSP. With first-hand experience on this franchise and 18 months to develop a game completely from scratch, it seemed High Impact Games was set for a successful debut. So why isn't their game as fondly remembered when compared to other Ratchet and Clank games? What did it lack that the others didn't? And how did it manage to become one of the most divisive entries in this entire franchise? Well, let's find out. This is Ratchet and Clank. Size matters. Following the events of Ratchet Deadlocked, our heroes feel that they've earned some R&R, so they decide to travel to the planet Pokutaru for a brief vacation. However, while they're there, they meet a young girl called Luna who came to the planet to write a school report on heroes. Seeing an opportunity to entertain a young fan, Ratchet and Clank spend some time showing off their fighting skills, much to Luna's delight. However, it's not long after this that they're attacked by mysterious robots who kidnap Luna. In the midst of this, our heroes discover proof of an ancient race of aliens known as Technomites, who were supposedly responsible for much of this galaxy's technology, but due to their microscopic size, most believe them to be a myth. So why did they kidnap a child? How did Luna discover one of the most advanced societies in the galaxy? And why on earth is Quark wearing a hat? Well, with a new mystery to solve and a girl to rescue, Ratchet and Clank cut their vacation short and set off once more into the galaxy. But as they begin to learn more about the Technomites and Luna's history with them, Ratchet and Clank quickly realize that their quest isn't as straightforward as they initially believed.
Whoa there, big guy. We're just getting started. Now, if you don't like the sight of blood, you might want to close your eyes.
So right from the outset, this is a pretty contrived story, even for this franchise. It feels far too forced to be taken seriously. Now granted, Ratchet and Clank did develop a habit of stumbling onto adventure. Hell, their whole relationship was founded by one big contrivance. The difference between those games though and this one is the quality of the writing. Yes, this is a franchise tailored for younger audiences, and yes, the storylines were always meant to be easy for the player to follow. However, that didn't stop the writers from making insightful commentary on modern society or ensuring that all of their characters were competent in their own way. For this story to work though, the writers basically had to dumb down everyone involved. Otherwise, they would have all realized very early on how deliberate the setup for this adventure was. Especially when we consider that by this point in their lives, Ratchet and Clank would be used to dealing with manipulative villains like the Technomites. The worst case of this character destruction though is Quark, who somehow, between the events of Deadlocked and Size Matters, has transformed into a giant child that's incapable of the simplest thoughts. Don't get me wrong, he was always a bit of a doofus, but never to this degree. They basically did to him what the MCU did to Thor, dumbed him down to such a degree that he's completely unrecognizable.
Quark, where do we take the artifact?
Try that big building. For some reason, the good stuff is always in the biggest buildings.
But that's not all. As the story progresses, you'll find that so many major revelations and plot MacGuffins in this game just show up with no proper setup whatsoever. More often, it feels like the developers are just trying to rush you from one planet to the next without giving the player any time to really appreciate the story being laid out in front of them. Like, consider the shrink ray, easily the most important gadget in the whole game and one of the founding pillars of which this story rests on. Without it, our heroes wouldn't be able to explore any of the worlds that the Technomites occupy or access the many locked doors you'll encounter throughout the game. You literally wouldn't be able to progress in the game without it. So how does Ratchet and Clank get the shrink ray? Well, basically, this space surfer shows up, challenges you to a hoverboard race, and after you win, he gives it to you. An incredibly rare piece of technology, and some random guy just hands it to you after losing a race. Seriously? Like, bear in mind, this guy is just a space surfer. He doesn't have a name, he's not a technomite, and he's in no way associated with them. And yet, for some reason, he keeps showing up in this story just to race you and hands over very important pieces of equipment whenever he loses. Do you see how weird this is? This isn't like the older games where you have to complete arena challenges in order to unlock some of the most important gadgets in the game. In both Ratchet 2 and 3, the arena missions were tied into the main story, and Ratchet was actively encouraged to take part in them by his supporting cast. But here though, the surfer feels so detached from the rest of the game that I wouldn't be surprised if he was a late addition that got slapped together with some unfinished assets. It'd certainly explain why the racing is so janky. Hell, if you think this is bad, on 2 separate occasions, Scrunch the monkey shows up out of nowhere to drop some important plot details and then just leaves without another word. One moment he's here, the next he's not. Then you've got the whole subplot where Captain Quark is attempting to find his biological parents, which is, for lack of a better word, completely pointless. It's basically just there to justify his inclusion in the story, and it ends on a rather unsatisfying note, resolved by another well-timed intervention courtesy of Scrunch. But easily the most infuriating plot beat is Ratchet's brief revenge arc that lasts only one planet. Within the span of a single level, Ratchet develops PTSD, struggles with his anger, and proceeds to destroy an entire space station. After which he's completely moved on from the whole experience, as if the trauma he went through only lasted as long as he was on the space station where it all happened. Because apparently, after watching Ratchet spend a third of his time in the original game hunting down Quark, High Impact obviously figured Ratchet would be more forgiving this time around. I'm sorry, but if there's one thing this franchise has made abundantly clear since day one, it's that when someone hurts Ratchet and his friends, he doesn't forgive them. He gets even.
I detect thugs for less ships at 1 o'clock.
It's payback time.
It seems whenever these writers try to introduce a new plot beat into this game, they either end up abandoning it, ignoring it for most of the story, or have it resolved by a third party in the most boring way possible. As a result, the whole story feels very rushed and suffers from a lack of proper setup, resulting in a very generic and predictable story. Which is probably what I find most disappointing about Size Matters. It's just too predictable. It's not just badly written, the whole narrative seems to go out of its way to steal ideas from other Ratchet and Clank games. You have an initially supportive character who turns into a villain, you've got a main antagonist with a secret motivation that goes against their people's more noble goals, and finally there's a side plot involving Quark that somehow ties into the game's final act. The difference though is that the previous Ratchet and Clank games took their time in setting up all these different plot beats and character revelations. Size Matters, on the other hand, moves so fast that you barely have any time to comprehend what's going on in the game. It doesn't help that there aren't any moments where you get to see the story from the villain's perspective, making them feel a lot more detached compared to other entries in this series. Still, that's not to say the whole story is bad. I was actually quite fond of the game's central theme of shrinking tech. Having to shrink down and explore miniaturized cities or even investigate the inside of Clank's robot body are the kind of absurd concepts that work really well in this franchise. I just wish the developers focused more on stuff like that rather than all these other half-baked ideas. If they'd taken the time to properly set up the shrink ray and iron out the story's flaws, this could have been a real gem of a game. But as it is now, I wouldn't exactly blame Insomniac if they decided to make this game non-canon, nor for most fans to flat out ignore Size Matters, especially when it's being backed up by some rather lackluster combat. Now let me be perfectly clear, the combat in this game isn't bad, far from it, it's still as engaging as any other entry in this franchise. Featuring a large plethora of weapons for Ratchet to upgrade, the traditional maneuvers that tie back to its platforming roots, a large ensemble of unique enemies to fight, along with a dynamic armor system that provides some distinctive customization options for the player. Hell, despite being built from the ground up for the PSP, control-wise it functions like any other mainstream Ratchet and Clank title. The only major differences are found with the lack of a second analog stick, which forces you to use the shoulder buttons to turn the camera. Yet even then, if you struggle with this control scheme, the game gives you the option to map the strafing to your analog stick, removing a lot of the difficulties with moving and aiming. The problem with Size Matters is that despite the potential found in its premise, high-impact games didn't do enough with the combat, especially when compared to the mainline titles. Usually, every entry in this series tries to make itself stand out in some way, whether by providing us with some unique weapon ideas, gameplay mechanics, or gadgets to influence how the combat plays out. But here, High Impact Games gave us one of the most bland combat loops in this entire franchise. One that seems to relish in its simplicity rather than indulging in any of the absurd ideas that made this franchise so beloved. While all the developers' more unique ideas are reserved for the game's many side activities. The consequences of this is that the game's combat suffers from a lack of originality, while the rest of Size Matters is seemingly overstuffed with pointless side content, resulting in an incredibly unfocused and unbalanced experience. Let me break this down for you, starting with the weapons. At its core, this is what Ratchet and Clank's combat is all about. Big absurd guns that defy conventional warfare but are perfectly suited to fighting against galactic tyranny. Most would agree that when it comes to this franchise, the weapons are one of its biggest focal points. So much so that a lackluster roster of guns can easily ruin an otherwise engaging combat loop. Sadly, that's the first big issue with the combat. The weapons are just too bland. Nothing really stands out. Sure, you've got series staples like the Rhino, the Agents of Doom, and the Morph Gun, but aside from them, it's just a rehash of ideas we've already seen before, like the bomb glove, a laser pistol, a shotgun, a flamethrower, a missile launcher, a sniper rifle, and even a shield dispenser. Where are the more absurd and dynamic weapon concepts like the plasma coil, the bouncer, the Visibomb launcher, or the Harbinger? There's nothing like that here. Sure, many games after this one would include these generic weapon archetypes as well, but the developers at Insomniac always tried to give them some unique twist to set them apart from prior entries, while High Impact Games didn't. They kept every weapon as simple as possible, most likely in an effort to save on processing power for the PSP. But this inadvertently made this weapon roster one of the most boring in the entire franchise. Now, to be fair, I could accept the lack of originality when it comes to this game's weapons, especially when considering that this was designed for a handheld console. That is, if the developers had taken the time to properly scale the weapons for the whole game, which sadly they didn't. This brings us on to the next big issue with Size Matters weapons, the lack of progression. Like any other entry post Ratchet and Clank 2, your weapons can be upgraded by acquiring XP from defeated enemies. This naturally encourages you to keep switching weapons in combat so that your whole arsenal can reach the peak of its power. A necessary step if one hopes to complete the endgame or attempt challenge mode afterwards. However, while the initial combat loop seems very straightforward, as you progress deeper into the game, you'll find that the weapons you possess quickly become outclassed by the enemies you fight. So much so that many of them effectively become useless, especially towards the end of the game where any fully upgraded weapon should have been able to deal with any high tier foe. But here, even if you had your whole arsenal fully upgraded and modded, enemies become so bullet spongy that by the end, the combat just becomes a grind to get through, resulting in you having to burn away most of your weapon's ammo just to kill a few enemies. Now don't get me wrong, I like a challenging gameplay loop, but forcibly increasing the difficulty like this doesn't help the player improve in combat. It just makes all the effort they put into upgrading their weapons feel like a waste of time. In no other game should the shotgun require you to waste several rounds just to kill a single enemy who's half your size. Nor should a missile launcher be incapable of killing multiple enemies in a single shot. Hell, even the weapon mods feel like a waste of time. Frankly, most of them should have just been included with your weapons right from the start, or simply given to you upon upgrading them to max, rather than forcing players to waste their bolts just to buy them. It doesn't help that most of these weapon mods don't even contribute to your overall damage output. Furthermore, most of them aren't even available unless you're in challenge mode, making their inclusion feel like an afterthought. This lack of progression, especially in regards to your weapon's damage output, just makes any attempts at self-improvement feel pointless. There's no real sense of getting stronger, which in turn results in a natural progression in difficulty. You're simply stuck in this state of perpetual unease throughout the whole game, a feeling that is most apparent whenever you take on one of the game's bosses. Sure, the attack patterns might be predictable, but the fact that most of them could just kill you in a few attacks kinda ruins the thrill of fighting them. That said, if there was a silver lining to be found in the combat, it would be in regards to Ratchet's armor. In previous games, you could buy new armor sets from special vendors, which aside from just altering your appearance, would come with the added benefit of decreasing the damage you take in combat, making them a highly sought after asset. But this time in Size Matters, armor is found in pieces throughout every level, meaning you'll have to reassemble these these suits in order to take full advantage of their damage decrease. This also means that since armor is divided into specific segments, you'll be able to mix and match to create new and unique armor sets. Upon completing a set, you'll acquire both a significant decrease in damage along with a unique ability, like freezing or burning enemies upon contact with your wrench, or planting mines whenever you hyperstrike. With powers like these and the natural protection the armor provides, the developers have done a good job of encouraging players to search their environment for secrets and collectibles, especially when one considers how much damage the enemies can do, so finding any way to ensure long-term survivability in combat is imperative. That being said, while the setup for exploring the galaxy is excellent, the execution is pretty poor. You might not notice it initially, but after you've cleared the first couple planets in this game, it becomes quite apparent what the problem is. Simply put, the worlds in Ratchet and Clank Size Matters lack both the scale and the complexity of the older games. Whereas in past games, there could be multiple routes for you to explore, large open spaces full of enemies to fight, or whole sections that require the right gadget in order to be engaged with, here all the planets follow the same basic pattern of leading you down a single path full of tight corridors and constrained arenas with very little verticality to be found. One of the byproducts of this more linear design is that the vast majority of the collectibles in this game aren't difficult to find. Most of them are just out in the open or slightly off the beaten path, or those few that are properly hidden away are placed in easy to get to spots. In fact, during my entire playthrough, there was only one collectible I actually struggled to find. Furthermore, out of the 8 worlds you can explore in this game, only one of them actually has a secret area that you can't reach initially. So as long as you're paying attention to your surroundings, there's no real reason for you to revisit any of these game worlds. It's pretty ironic for a game with such a big focus on scale to lack any proper scale in its environments. Despite the unique aesthetics it has, this lackluster implementation of the exploration mechanics leaves much to be desired. Instead of enjoying a natural sense of discovery, the player will end up feeling like they're being corralled from one set piece to the next, never having the chance to properly soak in the atmosphere, while all the puzzles you're faced with are just a means to slow the player down rather than serve as a genuine challenge for you to tackle. This is a far cry from what we're used to. The older titles took full advantage of their game's environments and gadgets to give us a series of multi-layered locations that varied in complexity. It was an attitude that encouraged the developers to get creative when hiding their collectibles, more often resulting in players having to think outside the box in order to track down every elusive secret. But here, high-impact games have taken all of the challenge out of exploration. Whether this could be a byproduct of them developing this game for the PSP is uncertain, but if that's the case, then perhaps they should have worked harder on optimization so we could get some larger and more complex environments on the handheld. Furthermore, this underwhelming environmental design goes a long way to highlight a key issue with Size Matters, and that's its over-reliance on side content. In prior games, the side challenges were nothing more than short sequences designed to test players and break up the gameplay. Sometimes you'd be guided towards them in order to obtain new gadgets or coordinates to a new planet, while other times they were just there to provide an easy means to gain more bolts or acquire new weapons. What matters though is that they were always used sparingly, never overstaying their welcome and never taking away time that could have been devoted to the core gameplay loop. This is the key issue with Size Matters. Since the game is so short, the developers had to find a way to pad out its length in order to make it feel like any other mainline entry in this series. So what'd they do? Basically, they dumped a crapload of side content onto the player, none of which was focused on the core tenets which this franchise was built upon, like the hoverboard racing. I already mentioned earlier how you're required to complete them in order to acquire some gadgets. Well, I also mentioned these races felt tacked on to the rest of the game, and frankly, I'm pretty confident in that assessment. The controls for the hoverboard races are absolutely atrocious. The turning is far too sensitive, your movement speed ranges from a snail's pace to the speed of light, and worst of all is the collision detection. All it takes is one bad turn or wrong landing and you're dead. To make matters worse, the racetracks have no walls or barriers to stop you from going out of bounds, meaning that if you time things right, with a single boost of speed you can basically skip over most of the racetracks. But if you think thou unsure sure and easy victory for you over the other races, then you're dead wrong. Since the AI is scaled to match your skill level, if you suddenly attained first place, then they'll instantly speed up to your position in no time at all. In other words, any lead you might have over them will be dead and buried within less than a few seconds. So yeah, if you thought the hoverboard races in the original Ratchet and Clank were bad, then give Size Matters a try. You'll quickly realize just how easy it is for someone to design a bad racing game. On the flip side though, the arena challenges are much more balanced. While in past games these were mainly centered around Ratchet, here instead it's Clank who takes on a variety of arena challenges, each of which is capable of testing the player in different ways. The first of which is Destruction Derby, a combat-focused battle royale in which you fight other robots in various types of vehicles. The objective is to be the last robot standing, no easy feat when all of your weapons are explicitly melee-based, and that's without taking into consideration all the in-game hazards, bosses, and other unique enemies you might end up fighting. Still, there are power-ups you can find to even the odds. Just be aware that your enemies can use them too. So while the pacing of the game mode can be a little rough at times, it still features a more consistent and thought-out design. Moving on to the second game mode, Gadgetbot Toss, which is basically robot basketball. The objective is to throw a Gadgetbot into a green scoring zone while preventing opposing players from doing the same, whether by hitting them, throwing bombs at them, or grabbing the Gadgetbot before they get the chance. With every challenge, the placement of the goalpost changes, as does the arena's layout, the number of opponents, and the number of goals required to win. Like the Destruction Derby, you might also have to deal with environmental hazards, but unlike the previous challenge, the threat of death is absent. The fact is, so long as your enemies haven't reached the score limit before you, the game isn't over. As such, this can quickly prove to be one of the more stressful arena challenges, but not as stressful as the third and final minigame, Gadgetbot Survival, a Lemmings-inspired game mode in which the player is tasked with leading their Gadgetbots into one or more compartments, while avoiding any hazards along the way. Every game starts off with you slowly amassing an army of Gadgetbots while Clank begins to issue commands to them. But since some of these orders can result in your robots dying, you'll need to carefully consider every move you make in order to complete the challenge. When compared to the other arena modes, this is definitely the most complex. It effectively tests your puzzle solving skills and encourages quick thinking without resorting to being blatantly unfair. As a whole though, while all these arena challenges have their fair share of difficulties, they are easily the most refined side challenges in this entire game. The giant Clank segments, on the other hand, well, they have and always will be a bloody nuisance. As if it wasn't bad enough that the developers force you to play an incredibly slow and unimaginative Clank level, they then decided to remind you of one of the least impressive aspects of Ratchet 1 and 2, the giant Clank battles. Only this time around, it's an on-the-rails shooter in which you're flying in space. Now granted, these segments wouldn't be so bad if they were merely a brief interlude, but funny enough, they're actually some of the longest and most difficult combat segments in the whole game. As if that wasn't bad enough, if by chance you die at any point during these space sections, then you have to start them from the beginning. Meaning that this brief interlude in space could potentially turn into a massive roadblock if you're not careful. The only real saving grace the giant Clank segments have is that thankfully the flying controls are relatively simple, so you shouldn't have too much difficulty avoiding damage. That is, unless you're playing on challenge mode, which is a whole other kind of monster. Thinking about it now, maybe I wouldn't have such a problem with all this side content if high-impact games had just done a better job at spacing them out. But due to the length of this game, the developers basically had to place them all right alongside each other, so the player doesn't really get a break from them. You go to one planet and you do the hoverboard racing, then the next planet has Clank's arena challenges, which then leads into a giant Clank segment, and after that, guess what? More hoverboard racing! It's just one needlessly convoluted hurdle after another. Compare that with Ratchet and Clank 2, which knew how to properly space out the arena challenges and space battles, so the focus always remained on the core gameplay rather than forcing the player to devote a third of their game time to mastering some increasingly difficult minigames. Furthermore, while they do offer some nice rewards upon completion, rather annoyingly, none of these prizes are scaled for challenge mode, so there's literally no point in tackling any of the side content on a second playthrough. That is unless you're really desperate for money, but considering challenge mode also features the bolt multiplier, that's unlikely to happen, making this yet another missed opportunity by the developers. Still, if there was one saving grace to be found here, it's that even on the PSP, Ratchet and Clank knows how to deliver a banger of a soundtrack. Composed by David Beauregard, a longtime affiliate of Insomniac Games, he's able to effectively render the ideal melodies for this portable sci-fi adventure, with each song perfectly catered to a planet's environment, along with its placement within the story. Like how the music on Pokitaru is able to evoke the spirit of the original game's theme whilst remaining its own jovial piece, perfect for the game's introduction. Or how about the dark and foreboding tune found on Caladon, an ideal song to set up the idea that something isn't quite right on this planet. Essentially, every song's tone and structure has been carefully molded for each world, ensuring that no two planets have the same atmosphere, something that is complemented further by some pretty decent sound design. From the natural growls of living beasts to the mechanized inner workings of robots to the unnatural symphonies conjured by your many weapons, Size Matters, like any other entry in this series, gives you the tools to craft your own orchestra of destruction, while the environmental sounds are mostly kept to a minimum, likely so that the focus isn't taken away from the game's soundtrack, which once again is excellent. Of course, there are a few instances where the game's ambience takes center stage, primarily in those levels where Ratchet and Clank are surrounded by nature. It's also here where the graphics tend to step up and showcase the raw power of the PSP. Naturally, for a game designed for handheld consoles, the visual fidelity is a step down from what you'd normally expect in this franchise. Since it would cost them additional processing power to maintain so many diverse landscapes, the developers had to tone down a lot of the background detail while also simplifying all their in-game assets. It's the reason why, even though this franchise loves to employ real-time cutscenes, high-impact games opted instead to use pre-rendered cutscenes for their game, since it would be a simple way to save on space. Still, that didn't stop the developers from getting creative with the game's aesthetics. Whether by employing a mixture of 2D and 3D effects, rendering in-game set pieces in real time, or simply presenting something small as insanely large. Unsurprisingly, some of the best looking levels in this game are when Ratchet and Clank have to shrink down, since it's here where the developers got to play around with the scale of a planet's environment. It's clear that high-impact games did what they could to make this game as dazzling as possible without having to sacrifice any of this franchise's charm. If only they'd been as considerate in regards to the third-person camera, which for most of the game only manages to show 2/3 of the game screen, with many other gameplay sequences throughout seemingly going the extra mile to obscure parts of your surroundings, meaning that for the entirety of Size Matters, you're basically stuck playing with a large chunk of your screen missing, more often resulting in you taking damage from enemies you simply can't see. To make matters worse, there's no way for you to expand your POV on the PSP version. You'd think they would have thought about this little detail when they originally developed the game, but I suppose it must not have been as important as the game's overall performance. Still, they did address this issue when they ported the game over to the PS2, so at the very least, console players got to enjoy a larger screen with a more visually rich game world. When we consider that this is Ratchet and Clank's first foray onto a portable gaming system, high-impact games still manage to provide players with a fun little romp into outer space. However, when you look at this game within the context of this franchise as a whole, Ratchet and Clank Size Matters is easily one of the most lackluster entries in this entire series. Not only does it feature one of the worst written stories in this entire franchise, but its combat is incredibly unbalanced. With a dull loadout of weapons, enemies that are poorly scaled for a lengthy campaign, and a camera that makes even the most basic combat encounters a hassle to get through. Sure, the game's armor system is a step up from what we're used to, and some of the locations are quite creative, but even though Size Matters features some of the most unique gimmicks in this whole franchise, it doesn't go far enough with them. The shrink ray is only ever used to its fullest potential on 3 different occasions, while the introduction of the Technomites does nothing for the franchise's lore. As for the game's many side activities, the less that is spoken of them, the better. In short, I wouldn't consider this to be the worst entry in this series, but it's definitely the blandest. It doesn't do enough to stand out on its own, and what it has to offer isn't enough to retain interest after a single playthrough. That said, if you haven't played Size Matters before, I definitely recommend doing so at least once, if for no other reason than to help you understand why the mainline titles are so beloved in the first place.